For many years, I've used a head tracking device. I started using it in ETS2, but very quickly used it in many of the simulation titles that I play, most notably Microsoft Flight Simulator. I find it not only immersive, but it also is essential when in the cockpit. My go-to choice for the last 10 years or so has been Track IR. It's been very reliable as a head tracker, but it suffers from one major issue in that it requires you to wear a reflective or infrared emitting device on your head or headset. For me, that meant ditching my high-quality wireless headset every time I sat down to go flying or driving, and then having to contend with cables once more. Recently, Tobii offered to send me the Tobii Eye Tracker 5. I was somewhat skeptical at first, as I didn't realise that the Tobii Eye Tracker is not just an eye tracker, it's also an extremely effective head tracker. I also didn't think that it would work with my curved, super widescreen monitor that I use when flying. I have to say though, I've been very impressed with the Tobii Eye Tracker. In this video, I will take you through the features and setup of the Tobii Eye Tracker 5 with Microsoft Flight Simulator. I will also talk you through my settings and help you to get the best out of it. Let's take a look at what's in the box. So inside the compact box, you will find the Tobii Eye Tracker itself. This is made out of aluminium, so it's quite lightweight and well made, and it has a USB 2 cable. It also has a USB extension cable should that not be long enough for you. There are two front-facing flat mounts and one flex mount. The Tobii Eye Tracker 5 magnetically attaches to one of these mounting plates. Each mounting plate is stuck to your monitor using the adhesive pads on the back. The front-facing mount is designed for flat screens only and sticks to the lower front of your monitor. The flex mount is designed to stick underneath your monitor and is adjustable to tilt the tracker as required. For curved monitors, the flex mounting is the best option. Now, the Tobii Eye Tracker 5 requires USB power, so it's best to plug directly into the computer or into a powered USB hub. Once you plug it in for the first time, it will automatically install the Tobii experience via the Windows App Store. If not, you can go to the Windows Store and download it manually, or go to the Tobii website and download it there. Next thing you'll need to do is monitor calibration. This is required because there's two white marks on top of the Tobii Eye Tracker, and these need to be aligned with the screen positions as shown. Simply move the white markers left and right until they sit right on top of the white dots on top of the eye tracker on either side. Because the Tobii Eye Tracker is magnetically mountable, it does mean that you can move it from one monitor to another, and you'll need to calibrate it for each monitor. Next up is user calibration. You need to calibrate the Tobii Eye Tracker's cameras for your head and your eyes. Different people can use your computer, and that's fine, but you'll need a different user profile for each person. Glasses and contact lenses work just fine, and you don't need to wear anything for the eye tracker to work. Visually impaired do have some extra options. You can choose whether to calibrate for both eyes or for one eye only. Calibration is done by sitting still and looking at each of the 6 dots that it presents to you until they explode. Once all the dots are complete, the calibration is done and the Tobii Eye Tracker is ready for use. So, once you've got the Tobii Eye Tracker all set up and you've calibrated it for yourself and for your monitor, I'd give your PC a quick reboot to make sure all those drivers are loaded properly. Having then done that, it's time to fire up Microsoft Flight Simulator. Now, Microsoft Flight Simulator contains native support for the Tobii Eye Tracker, so it should recognize it straight away, but we're going to check that in a second. If you're playing a game that doesn't have native support, you need to download the Tobii Game Hub. More details on that on their website. So the first thing we need to do is check that Microsoft Flight Simulator has recognized the eye tracker. Click on Options and then go to Control Options. And along the top, you'll have your devices that you have connected, and it's recognized. If you scroll along, you should see Tobii, which will have a default profile. If you don't see Tobii here, it means the Microsoft Flight Simulator has not seen and connected to the Tobii Eye Tracker. So you need to step back, take a look at the software you've got installed, and if you're still having trouble, try uninstalling and reinstalling it again. Now, having done that, what you need to do is create another profile. You can't change this, the default profile. So what you need to do is click on Open Preset Manager, click on duplicate and create something with your name and click OK. This will now be able to modify, but we'll change that in a second. What you now need to do is come back to your keyboard and click on search by name and put the word track. Now this should bring up two options here. You will not have these keys set to this, but these are the two options we're looking for. The first one will toggle the head tracking. In other words, it will turn it on and off. It's useful when you want to pause the head tracking. I've assigned that to the comma key. The next one is the eye tracking reset. This we'll need in a second when we spawn into a plane, and you'll need it every time you spawn into a plane, so I've set that to the full stop key. You can of course choose any keys you like, and if you have a Stream Deck you can then map some buttons perhaps to these keys, or you can map it to one of your flight controls. Now when you first spawn into the cockpit, you may find that you're positioned just behind the pilot's seat. This happens sometimes. If it does, just press the tracking camera reset button, in my case the full stop key, just press it twice and it should put you back into the pilot's seat. I'm going to unpause it now using my pause key, and you'll also find that any sort of slight movements with your eyes or your head causes your camera to fly around. This is great, it means the tracking is working, but equally I wouldn't like to fly like this. What we need to do is make some settings changes. But before we do that, I just want to explain a few little concepts that we're going to see in the options for the Tobii Eye Tracker. Firstly, this is pitch. So this is where you move your head up and down, and you'll notice that slight movement in my head, I can look quite a long way up and down, and the same thing happens with yaw. So yaw is where you'll turn your head from left to right. You'll notice if I turn my head perhaps 50 degrees, something like that, I'm almost looking behind me. Now these things are configurable. The last thing is the roll option. So this is where you sort of roll your head, and this is useful if you're maybe turning into a base turn, just sort of leaning in, doing some dog fighting maybe, you know, it's quite useful. But maybe if you're flying in a commercial airplane like this, maybe not so useful. So you might want to dial that down a bit. One thing by default that is not enabled is your position. The other degrees of movements, which are if you move forward and backwards, or if you move left and right, you'll notice that nothing happens. The default profile zeroes out those mappings, so if we want that, we'll need to re-enable it. So let's go back into the control options now and see if we can make some changes. So let's jump back into control options, and we'll go over to the Tobii profile that we already created here over here, and we'll click on the sensitivity button. Now this brings up a set of options. This is the Tobii Eye Tracker default. We've got a bunch of options here, and this will allow you to fine-tune the Tobii Eye Tracker to work how you want it to work. I will give you my final settings on what I use, but I want to explain each option to you. So first of all, this is the eye versus head tracking ratio. With this ratio, it's basically saying how much of your head versus your eye is contributing towards moving the camera. So if you just want full head tracking, you would set this to 1. And what that would mean is if you move your head around, the camera will move. If you move your eyes around, nothing will happen. Let's try that on 1. Right, so here I am looking forward. You'll notice if I move my head to the right and left, the camera moves. But if I look around, absolutely nothing happens. And I can prove this while turn on the eye tracker overlay, and you should now see the position of my eyes, and as I move around, nothing is happening. If we go back into the options, and we'll put this all the way down to 0, so now you'll notice if I turn my head but keep my eyes looking in one place, the camera doesn't move. But if I start to look around, the camera will follow it. So with that option, you can decide how much eye tracking versus head tracking you actually want. This also ties in with the next option, which is the eye tracking responsiveness. So a higher value for this, and the camera will respond much more quickly to your eye movements, and a lesser option, the eye will respond more slowly to your eye movements. So this is useful if you don't want the camera to be darting around every time your eyes move. It will be a delay if it's down here. It'll be instantaneous if it's up here. Personally, I don't use the eye tracking, so what I'm going to do is do this. I'm going to maximize my head tracking and effectively turn off my eye tracking. The next two options we'll look at are the head tracking sensitivity pitch yaw and the head tracking sensitivity roll. I think this shouldn't be called sensitivity, this should be called multiplier. And the reason is, if you've got head tracking sensitivity roll of 1, it means that if you move your head if you sort of roll your head by 45 degrees, then in game it'll roll the camera by 45 degrees. Whereas if I set that to a value of 2, if I rolled my head by 45 degrees now, it would actually roll the camera twice as much. It would roll it by 90 degrees. So these are the options that allow you to adjust how sensitive, or the multiplier if you like, of movements of your head versus movements of pitch, yaw, and roll. The other option is center stabilization. This is an effect like creating a dead zone. The higher that you put this value, the more the camera will have a tendency to stay in its main position and not move as you start to move your head. So if you put this right down to 0, and I'll demonstrate that. Okay, so I'm making just very slight head correction. Remember, I turned off the eye tracking. I'll put the eye tracker on just to prove this. I'm looking around and you should see absolutely no movements of the eyes affect the camera now. But you can see how even just the slightest movement, the camera is following. Now this is great if you want an authentic kind of experience where any slight movement to your head causes the camera to move. However, I do find it a little bit more comfortable to have a little bit of delay to that so that I can actually move my head around and just look at things without the camera necessarily following me around. So if we slide that up to say 0.5, a sort of modest stabilization value. Well, now look, I can sort of move my head around and the camera's not really following. See, I can make these small movements and there's a definite dead zone here. But if I sort of start to move around now, you can see I'm having to turn quite a lot to almost pull the camera out of this middle dead zone, you see? That's a bit too much, isn't it? This is a value that you need to play with to find what works for you. Let's try it on something like 0.2. So now there's a decent dead zone there, but I can pull it out of that dead zone, but once I start looking vaguely in this direction, it'll snap back to its default position. Okay, so that's comfortable. Final two values we're going to look at are these bottom two here. This bottom one here is very simple to explain. This is either on or off. This is the head tracking auto center. Effectively what this does, if it's turned on, is it will automatically drift the camera back to that center point, even when you don't do anything. Personally, I don't like it. You may like it, I don't like it. I prefer to just reset my camera back to center if I need to, using the reset key. But I don't like the camera drifting, otherwise it gets out of sync with my head. Final option is this one, head tracking sensitivity position. Now this is the one that I mentioned to you about any sort of lateral or forward or backwards movement. It is disabled by default. Let's try putting that up to 1 and testing that out. Okay, so that's me just pressing the reset to center everything. And now you'll notice if I go to the left or go to the right, it actually affects the camera. Same if I go forward or I go backward, or even if I go up and down. Now this can actually be extremely useful in GA flying. You know, when you've got controls that are just a little bit out of position, you just need to lean forward and look for something. Fantastic. It's also great in something like the Airbus here because it means I can lean over, back and up and actually look at these controls properly. Again, the values of multiplication or sensitivity as it calls it will affect how much you actually need to move in order to do the things that you want to do. And you may want to create different profiles for different planes just because, well, in a commercial plane you don't want to move around so much, whereas in a GA you might. But that's what all the values do, and I'll now show you what values I use by default. So what we'll do is we'll flick over to my squirrel profile and click save on that, and I'll show you my values here. So again, I use head tracking of 1 and eye tracking responsiveness of 0 because I do not want any eye tracking. Partly that's because I tend to read chat when I'm live streaming and I don't want the camera to follow my eyes, but also partly because I just kind of like head tracking. I'm used to that and not really used to eye tracking. If you do want this, a good value is 0.85, and just bring that up and you'll get a little bit of response out your eyes. Next up is my head tracking pitch, short and roll. I find 1.4 works quite well for me, so that means when I'm sort of yawing like that, I get a 1.4 multiplier on my head movement. But for roll, I tend to keep it on 1, just because I don't tend to roll a lot. And when I do roll, I want it to follow roughly what I'm doing. Center stabilization 0.29, I find that works well for me. That's a little bit more than what I showed you earlier. And then we've got the head tracking sensitivity position of 1. Again, that's the lateral and forward and backward movement, up and down movement. And I turn off auto center completely. So the values that I use, that I've worked out over a period of time, this is my go-to set. Now, as I've already explained, Tobii Eye Tracker will work with or without glasses. I'm wearing glasses and it's absolutely fine. And contact lenses are also fine. Another question you often get is, does it work in low light conditions? Well, I'm going to turn off all my lights here in my studio. And as you can see, I've been plunged into almost complete darkness. And my head tracking is working absolutely fine. And I will even show you, despite the fact I'm not using eye tracking, you should be able to see the overlay. And you'll see that everything's working fine. Now, the only thing to bear in mind with eye tracking is that it can only track your eyes if it can see your eyes. If you turn your sort of head away like this, then gradually it can't see what your eyes are doing. Whereas your head, it can track you turning all the way around, no problem at all. But the eye tracking is slightly limited. But as you can see, it has absolutely no problem in low light conditions or in quite bright light conditions. Now, if you've got your back to a very sunny window, maybe it'll start to struggle, but just close the curtains. As long as you've got some light or even very little light, this thing will work absolutely fine. So really, the million-dollar question is, what is it like to use when you're actually flying? Well, as I said at the start of this video, I can't live without this head tracking technology. And the Tobii Eye Tracker is by far the simplest thing that I've used. I've got my wireless headphones on, which means I can get in and out of my rig, I can move around without any cables, I haven't got to wear anything, I've not got a sensor on here or a track IR here. It's brilliant for that. And don't forget, you can still use all your camera views. So if I bring my camera into my tablet, I can still sort of move around, but it doesn't stop me from using camera views. Same thing with a wing view. If I go for like a passenger view like this, I can still sort of, just look out the window like that, quick glance that way. It still works no matter what the camera position is. And once you've got your settings dialed in, you'll be able to do things like, glance up at your overhead and flick your seatbelt signs on and off as you see fit, turn your lights on and off. You can look down and check your instrumentation, see if everything's okay. That's the beauty of this stuff. This is a commercial plane. In a GA plane, it's even better. There we go. So I spawned in the turbine Duke, and you can see, as I said earlier, sometimes it'll spawn you behind the pilot seat. Just press the reset key twice, and you'll be back in the cabin. Okay, so from here, you can see we can look around all around the cabin. Again, the camera views, if I just switch over to the Duke, the camera views will all work. And once I'm in the camera view, I can even sort of move around and look at various switches. So in a GA plane, like I say, it's even more effective because the controls are often low down and off to one side, and you might have a fixed number of camera views, but they don't cover everything, and just being able to look around is incredibly helpful. But the real power of a head tracker comes in when you start to fly. See, with GA flying, you do tend to look around a lot more. You tend to be flying visual a lot more, and you need to keep that situational awareness going. And the Tobii Eye Tracker just gives you the ability to do what you would just do naturally in the cockpit, which is look around, make sure you're going where you want to be going. without having to use awkward camera views. And for GA flying, I think it is just almost essential just to get the best out of things. Like if you really want, if you don't have head tracking and then you fly with head tracking, trust me, you will not want to fly without head tracking again. So, to summarise, the Tobii Eye Tracker 5 has native support out of the box for Microsoft Flight Simulator, DCS, X-Plane, ETS2, Farm Sim 22, Star Citizen, the list goes on. You don't need to wear anything, you don't need to wear any IR emitters or reflective things on a hat or on a headset, it just works. You can move between monitors, so you can have a desk monitor, a rig monitor perhaps, and because it's magnetically mountable, you can just move it between the monitors. You can configure it for multiple users. It will work with those who are visually impaired. They can configure it for themselves. It works in a variety of lighting conditions. So you saw it working in near darkness, and it also works in bright light, no problem at all. You can put it on a curved monitor or on a flat monitor. It's entirely up to you. It's accurate. Once you set it up and calibrate it, you'll honestly wonder how you ever coped without it. There is a discount link and a code in the video description if you want to save yourself some money. If you enjoyed the video, please give me a thumbs up. That's it, guys. Take care. Happy flying.